She described the house in perfect detail, the color of the wallpaper, the pattern on the dishes, the view from the bedroom window. Problem was, that house had burned down in 1924, and she'd never been anywhere near it, at least not in this lifetime. The therapist's voice was soft, counting backward, guiding her deeper. Claire felt the familiar sensation of her body becoming heavy, her mind becoming light, the boundaries between present and past starting to blur and dissolve. The office around her faded, the sound of rain against the windows disappeared. Even her own breathing seemed to come from somewhere far away. And then she felt it, that strange pulling sensation, like being drawn backward through a tunnel that existed outside of normal space and time. The air changed first. It felt thicker somehow, heavier, filled with smells that didn't exist in the modern world. Coal smoke and horse manure and something else, something she couldn't quite name but that felt achingly familiar. She could hear sounds filtering through, distant and muffled at first but growing clearer. Horses clip-clopping on cobblestones, voices calling out in accents that belonged to another era. The rattle of wooden carriage wheels. Her feet touched solid ground, and she looked down to see different shoes. Black leather boots, buttoned up the side, slightly scuffed and worn. Not her shoes. These belonged to someone else, someone she used to be. Claire had come to Dr. Richard Mason's office because of nightmares. The same nightmare, actually, repeating almost every night for the past 6 months. In the dream, she was in a house she didn't recognize, and the house was on fire. She could feel the heat, smell the smoke, hear the crackle of flames consuming wood and fabric. She was searching desperately for someone, calling out a name she could never quite remember when she woke up, and then the floor would collapse beneath her feet and she'd fall into darkness. She always woke up gasping, her heart pounding, her sheets soaked with sweat. The fear stayed with her for hours afterward, making it impossible to go back to sleep. She'd tried sleeping pills, therapy, everything. Nothing helped. The nightmare kept coming back, night after night, getting more vivid and more detailed each time. Her therapist had finally suggested past life regression as a possibility. Maybe the nightmare wasn't just her subconscious working through stress or anxiety. Maybe it was a genuine memory from another lifetime trying to break through. Claire had been skeptical at first, didn't really believe in reincarnation, but she was desperate enough to try anything. Now, standing in this other time with unfamiliar shoes on her feet, Claire felt that same terror from her nightmares rising in her chest. But mixed with the terror was something else, recognition. She knew this place, she knew this time, and somehow, she knew that what she was about to remember would explain everything. She looked around, trying to orient herself. She was standing on a street in what looked like a small town. The buildings were old-fashioned, made of brick and wood, with signs painted directly on the walls advertising goods and services. The cars parked along the street were vintage, the kind you'd see in museums, black and boxy with running boards and spare tires mounted on the back. Claire's consciousness settled more fully into this other body, and suddenly she knew. Her name was Margaret. Margaret Foster. She was 23 years old, and the year was 1924. Margaret lived in the small town of Ashford, somewhere in upstate New York. Claire could see the name on a shop sign across the street, Ashford General Store. The town was small, maybe 1,500 people, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and strangers were noticed immediately. Margaret worked as a seamstress, making and altering clothes for the townspeople. She was good at it, had a natural eye for how fabric should drape, how seams should be finished, how to make even simple clothes look elegant and well-made. Her mother had taught her the trade, and Margaret had taken over the small shop when her mother died 3 years earlier. She lived alone in a small house on Maple Street, a 2-story wooden structure painted white with green shutters. The house had belonged to her parents, and after they both passed, it had become hers. It was too big for one person, really, with 3 bedrooms and a parlor, and a kitchen with a coal stove that required constant tending. But it was home, the only home she'd ever known, and she couldn't imagine living anywhere else. Margaret's days followed a predictable pattern: wake early, light the stove, make breakfast, walk to her shop on Main Street, unlock the door, prepare for the day's work. Customers would come throughout the day with requests for new dresses, repairs to old clothes, alterations for growing children. Margaret would measure and cut and sew, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency through fabric and thread. Evenings, she'd return home, cook a simple dinner, read by lamplight until her eyes grew tired. It was a quiet life, some might say lonely, but Margaret found peace in the routine, in the simple satisfaction of work done well. But there was something else, someone else, that made Margaret's life less lonely than it might have been. His name was William Harper. And he was the reason Claire's heart, Margaret's heart, beat faster every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon when he'd stop by the shop. William was a teacher at the local school, teaching mathematics and science to students ranging from age 8 to 15. He was 26, tall and slim, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He'd come to Ashford 2 years earlier from Boston, taking the teaching position when the previous teacher retired. Margaret had met him when he brought in some shirts that needed mending, buttons replaced, and a torn seam repaired. They'd started talking, discovering they both loved books, both enjoyed long walks in the countryside, both felt slightly out of place in the small town despite living there. William because he came from a city and still carried a few urban sensibilities, Margaret because she'd always been more thoughtful and introspective than the other girls her age, had never quite fit into the expected role of finding a husband and starting a family. Their friendship had deepened over months of conversation. William would stop by the shop even when he didn't need any sewing done, ostensibly to discuss a book he'd read or ask her opinion on some philosophical question, but really just to see her, to talk with her, to spend time in her presence. Margaret knew she was falling in love with him, and she was fairly certain he felt the same way about her, but neither of them had spoken it aloud yet. There was a delicacy to their relationship, a carefulness, as if putting words to their feelings might somehow shatter the fragile beauty of what was developing between them. Claire experienced all of this through Margaret's consciousness, feeling the gentle warmth of a love that was growing slowly, patiently, without rush or pressure. It was different from modern dating, this careful courtship, no casual hookups or ambiguous relationships, just two people taking their time to truly know each other before making any commitments. One evening in late October, William finally spoke his heart. He'd walked Margaret home from the shop, as he often did, and they stood on her front porch in the golden light of sunset. The trees were brilliant with fall colors, red and orange, and yellow leaves drifting down around them like confetti. "Margaret," William said, his voice slightly unsteady, "I need to tell you something. I've been wanting to say this for months, but I kept waiting for the right moment, and now I realize there's no such thing as the perfect moment. There's just now, so I'm going to say it. I love you. I've loved you for a long time. And if you'll have me, I'd like to ask your father's permission to court you properly, with the intention of marriage." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She'd hoped, but hadn't been certain. And hearing the words spoken aloud made everything suddenly real and possible and terrifying and wonderful all at once. "My father is dead," she said softly, "so you can't ask his permission, but you can ask me. And my answer is yes. Yes to courting. Yes to all of it." William's face lit up with joy, and he took her hand, holding it gently, reverently, as if it were something precious and fragile. "I don't have much to offer you," he admitted. "A teacher's salary is modest. I can't provide the kind of life a wealthier man could. But I promise I'll work hard, I'll be faithful, and I'll love you every day of my life. That's all I want," Margaret said. "That's more than enough." They married the following spring, in a simple ceremony at the Methodist church with most of the town in attendance. Margaret wore a dress she'd made herself, white cotton with lace trim, elegant in its simplicity. William wore his best suit, nervous and happy and unable to stop smiling. They moved into Margaret's house on Maple Street, the house that had been in her family for 2 generations. William's salary combined with Margaret's income from the sewing shop gave them a comfortable life, not wealthy but secure. They were happy in a way that didn't need grand gestures or expensive things, just the daily pleasure of being together, of building a life side by side. Claire felt Margaret's contentment, her deep satisfaction with the life she'd built. This was what she'd wanted, what she'd hoped for, and she'd found it with William. They talked about having children someday, about growing old together in this house, about all the years stretching ahead of them full of ordinary moments and quiet joy. But beneath the happiness, Claire sensed something else, a shadow, a threat that Margaret was unconsciously aware of but that lurked at the edges of her awareness like a predator waiting in the dark. The winter of 1924 was particularly harsh. Snow fell early and often, piling up in drifts that made the streets nearly impassable. The temperature dropped so low that the water in the wash basin froze solid overnight despite the fire in the stove. People huddled in their homes, burning coal and wood to stay warm, going out only when absolutely necessary. Margaret and William spent their evenings close to the stove, reading aloud to each other, playing cards, talking about everything and nothing. It was a cozy time, despite the bitter cold outside. A time when their small house felt like the safest, warmest place in the world. But the cold created other problems. Fires became more common as people burned more fuel, as stoves were kept burning hotter and longer, as coal dust accumulated in chimneys creating fire hazards. Margaret heard about several houses in neighboring towns that had burned during the winter, families left homeless in the freezing temperatures. She and William were careful, always making sure the stove was properly banked at night, always checking that no embers had fallen onto the wooden floor, always keeping buckets of water nearby just in case. But accidents happened. Even careful people couldn't control everything. It was a Tuesday night in February. Margaret and William had gone to bed early, exhausted from a long day of work. The stove in the kitchen was burning low, providing just enough heat to keep the worst of the cold at bay. Snow was falling outside, soft and silent, blanketing the town in white. Margaret woke sometime in the middle of the night to the smell of smoke. Not the normal smell of coal burning in the stove, but something sharper, more acrid, wood smoke. She sat up, instantly alert, her heart starting to pound. "William," she said, shaking her husband awake. "Something's wrong. I smell smoke." William woke quickly, sniffing the air, and his face went pale. He jumped out of bed and opened the bedroom door. Smoke poured in, thick and choking. He slammed the door shut immediately. "The house is on fire," he said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "We need to get out now." Claire felt Margaret's terror spike. This was the nightmare. This was the moment she'd been dreaming about for months in her current life as Claire. She was living it now, experiencing it in real time through Margaret's consciousness. William grabbed a quilt from the bed and soaked it in the water pitcher on the nightstand. He wrapped it around Margaret's shoulders. "Stay low," he instructed. "The smoke rises. We need to get to the stairs and then out the front door. Stay close to me." They opened the door again and crawled into the hallway. The smoke was dense, stinging Margaret's eyes, filling her lungs, making it hard to breathe. She could hear the fire now, a roaring, crackling sound coming from downstairs, could feel the heat radiating up through the floorboards. William led the way toward the stairs, moving as quickly as they could while staying low. But when they reached the stairway, Margaret's heart sank. The entire first floor was engulfed in flames. The stairs themselves were on fire, the wooden banister blazing like a torch. "We can't go down," William said, coughing. "We need another way out." They retreated back down the hallway to the spare bedroom at the back of the house. William opened the window, and cold air rushed in, feeding the fire behind them, making it roar louder. "We'll have to jump," William said. "It's only the second floor. The snow will cushion the fall." He climbed out first, hanging from the windowsill to reduce the drop, then letting go. Margaret heard him land in the snow below. "I'm okay," he called up. "Your turn. I'll catch you." Margaret climbed onto the windowsill, her hands shaking, her lungs burning from smoke. She could hear the fire getting closer, could feel the heat at her back. She had to jump, had to get out. But then she remembered her mother's wedding ring, the only thing she had left from her parents. She'd taken it off before bed and left it on the dresser in the main bedroom. She couldn't leave it, couldn't let it burn. "Wait," she called down to William. "I need to get something. Just 1 minute." "Margaret." "No," William shouted. "There's no time. You have to jump now." But Margaret was already moving, crawling back down the smoke-filled hallway toward the bedroom. She could barely see, could barely breathe. The heat was intense now, the fire spreading rapidly through the old wooden house. She made it to the bedroom, found the dresser, grabbed the ring, got it. Now, she just needed to get back to the window, to William, to safety. She turned to leave, and the floor collapsed beneath her. Claire felt the sickening lurch of the fall, the terror of plunging through burning wood into the inferno below. Felt the impact that knocked the air from Margaret's lungs. Felt the pain, sharp and overwhelming. Felt the smoke filling her lungs, suffocating her. And then, through the roar of the flames, she heard William screaming her name, heard him trying to get back into the burning house, to save her. Heard other voices, neighbors who'd seen the fire, holding him back, telling him it was too late. The house was gone, she was gone. Margaret's last conscious thought wasn't fear or regret. It was love. Love for William. sadness that their life together had been cut short, and a deep, aching wish that she could tell him it wasn't his fault, that he shouldn't blame himself, that she'd made the choice to go back for the ring and the consequences were hers alone. And then darkness, pain fading, consciousness dissolving. Margaret Foster's life ending in the burning house on Maple Street in February of 1924. Claire experienced Margaret's death fully, felt the transition from physical existence to whatever came after. There was a moment of confusion, of disorientation, and then a sense of lifting, of moving upward, of her consciousness separating from the broken, burning body below. She could see the scene from above now, the house fully engulfed in flames, lighting up the snowy night. Neighbors gathered in the street, some forming a bucket brigade, though it was clearly too late to save the structure. William, on his knees in the snow, held back by two men, his face twisted in anguish and grief. Margaret's consciousness hovered there, wanting to comfort him, wanting to tell him she was okay, that death wasn't the end, that her love for him transcended physical form. But there was no way to communicate, no bridge between her disembodied state and his physical reality. She watched as the house collapsed completely, sending up a shower of sparks and embers into the snowy sky. Watched as William finally stopped struggling, his body going limp with the acceptance of loss. Watched as he was led away by neighbors to stay with another family, since he now had nowhere else to go. And then Margaret felt herself being pulled away, drawn towards something brighter, something that existed beyond the physical world entirely. She resisted at first, wanting to stay with William, wanting to watch over him, wanting to make sure he'd be okay. But a presence made itself known, gentle but insistent. A guide, perhaps, or just a deeper part of her own consciousness. And that presence communicated a truth. William would grieve, would suffer, but he would survive. He would live another 40 years, would eventually remarry, though he'd never love anyone quite the way he'd loved Margaret, would have children and grandchildren, would die peacefully in his sleep at age 66, and when he did, Margaret would be there to welcome him home, because this wasn't the end. This was just the end of one chapter. Consciousness continued, love continued, and someday, they would find each other again. Maybe in another lifetime, maybe in another form, but the connection they'd built, brief as it had been in physical terms, was eternal. Margaret let go of her attachment to that life, to that body, to that brief happiness that had been cut short. She moved toward the light, toward the space between lives where healing happened and lessons were processed and new incarnations were planned. And in that space, she understood, the fire hadn't been punishment or bad luck or cosmic cruelty. It had been a learning experience, harsh but valuable. She'd learned about love, about the preciousness of every moment, about the importance of choosing wisely when to take risks. Going back for the ring had been a choice, and while she wouldn't have made the same choice with hindsight, she also understood that growth often came through mistakes, through experiencing consequences, through learning what worked and what didn't. The time came for another incarnation. Margaret's soul, enriched by the experiences of that lifetime and countless others, prepared to be born again, this time as Claire Wilson, born in 1995 in Seattle. A completely different life, a completely different set of circumstances and challenges and opportunities, but the memory remained, buried deep in the subconscious. And when Claire turned 30, when she'd lived longer than Margaret ever had, something triggered. The old memory started bleeding through in the form of nightmares. Margaret's death, replaying night after night, trying to bring something to Claire's conscious awareness. What was it trying to tell her? What lesson from that life needed to be integrated in this one? Claire gasped as she returned to full awareness in Dr. Mason's office. Her face was wet with tears, her body shaking slightly. But unlike the nightmares that left her terrified and disoriented, this experience left her with clarity, understanding, peace. Dr. Mason sat quietly, letting her process. He'd recorded the entire session, as he always did, and Claire's descriptions of the house, the town, the fire, had been remarkably detailed and consistent. "How do you feel?" he asked gently. Claire thought about it. "I feel sad," she said, "for Margaret, for William, for the life they didn't get to finish. But I also feel grateful. Does that make sense? Grateful for the experience, for the love they shared, even though it ended tragically." Dr. Mason nodded. "And the nightmares, do you understand them better now?" "Yes," Claire said. "They were memories trying to break through. Margaret's death trying to be remembered and processed. I think once I've fully integrated this, the nightmares will stop." But something was nagging at Claire. The level of detail she'd remembered, the specificity of the names and places. Was this real? Had Margaret Foster actually existed? Or was this just an elaborate story her subconscious had constructed to help her process some other issue? Is there a way to verify this? She asked Dr. Mason. To check if any of what I remembered was real. Dr. Mason smiled slightly. That's always the question, isn't it? I can tell you that many of my clients have had verifiable details come through in past life regressions, things they couldn't have known normally. But verification requires research. Would you want to do that? Claire thought about it. Part of her was afraid. What if she researched and found nothing? What if Ashford didn't exist, or did exist, but there was no record of Margaret Foster or William Harper or a house fire in 1924? Would that mean the entire experience was just fantasy? But another part of her needed to know, needed to find out if this was real memory or constructed imagination. Over the following weeks, Claire became an amateur historian. She started with online searches, looking for information about towns named Ashford in upstate New York. She found several, but one in particular caught her attention. Ashford, New York, a small town in Cattaraugus County. Population today around 2,000. In 1924, it would have been smaller, maybe 1,500 people. Just like in her regression, she found historical societies, local libraries, archives that might have records from that era. She made phone calls, sent emails, explained she was researching her family history and was looking for information about people who might have lived in Ashford in the 1920s. The response from the Ashford Historical Society was promising. Yes, they had records from that period. Yes, they could help with research. She would need to either visit in person, or they could scan documents for a small fee. Claire decided to visit. She took time off work and drove the 6 hours from her home in Connecticut to Ashford, New York. The town was small, just as she'd imagined, with a main street that still had some of the old brick buildings from the 1920s. At the Historical Society, a volunteer named Martha greeted her warmly. Claire explained what she was looking for without mentioning the past life regression, just saying she was researching distant relatives named Margaret Foster and William Harper. Martha led her to a room filled with filing cabinets and boxes of old documents. We have census records, property deeds, church registries, newspaper archives, she explained. What year are you interested in? 1924, Claire said, her heart pounding. Martha pulled out several boxes and laid them on a table. Census from 1920 would have residents who were still here in 1924. Property records might have deeds, and newspapers from that year. We have most of them on microfilm. Claire started with the census records. She flipped through pages of handwritten entries, names and ages and occupations, and there, on page 17, she found it. Foster, Margaret, age 18, in 1920. Occupation, seamstress. Living at 147 Maple Street. Claire's hands started shaking. She'd never mentioned the house being on Maple Street to Dr. Mason during the regression. That detail had come up afterward when she was describing the memory to herself. But here it was in the census record. She kept searching and found William Harper in the 1920 census as well, though he would have been new to town that year according to her regression memory. Harper, William, age 22, occupation, teacher, boarding on Church Street. The records were real, the people were real. But what about the fire? Claire asked Martha about newspaper archives from February 1924. Martha showed her how to use the microfilm reader and loaded the reels, containing issues of the Ashford Gazette from that winter. Claire scrolled through slowly, checking each issue. And then, in the February 14th edition, she found it. The headline read, "Tragic Fire Claims Life of Local Woman." The article described how the Foster house on Maple Street had burned in the early morning hours of February 12th. Margaret Foster Harper, age 23, wife of teacher William Harper, had perished in the blaze. Her husband had escaped with minor injuries, but his wife had apparently returned to the house to retrieve something and been trapped when the floor collapsed. The house was a complete loss. The cause was determined to be a spark from the kitchen stove igniting the wooden structure. Claire sat back from the microfilm reader, tears streaming down her face. It was all true. Every detail she'd remembered. The house on Maple Street, the marriage to William, the fire in February, even the detail about going back to retrieve something and the floor collapsing. Martha, seeing Claire's emotional reaction, came over with concern. "Are you all right? Did you find what you were looking for?" "Yes," Claire said. I found exactly what I was looking for, she explained then, hesitantly, about the past life regression. Martha listened without judgment. You wouldn't be the first person to come here looking for past life connections, Martha said. This happened several years ago, too. A woman from California who remembered living here in the 1800s found her name in the church registry and everything. Martha pulled up more records for Claire. Death certificate for Margaret Foster Harper, marriage certificate from May 1923, property records showing the house on Maple Street had been in the Foster family since 1889, passed to Margaret after her parents' deaths in 1921, and then Martha showed her something Claire hadn't expected, a photograph from the Ashford School records, a group photo of teachers from 1924, and there, standing in the back row, was William Harper. Dark hair, intelligent eyes, exactly as Claire had remembered him. Martha also found a photo of the house on Maple Street, taken before the fire for insurance purposes. White clapboard, green shutters, 2 stories. Claire recognized it immediately. This was the house from her memories, from her nightmares. She left the Historical Society with copies of all the documents and photographs, feeling shaken but also validated. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't fantasy. She really had lived before, as Margaret Foster, in this town, in that house, and she really had died in that fire in 1924. The drive home gave her time to process. What did this mean? If reincarnation was real, if she really had been Margaret Foster in a previous life, what were the implications for her current life as Claire Wilson? She thought about the lesson that had come through at the end of her regression, about choosing wisely when to take risks, about the preciousness of every moment, about not taking life or love for granted because it could end suddenly and unexpectedly. And she thought about her current relationship. She'd been dating someone named Mark for 2 years. He'd proposed 3 months ago, and she'd been hesitating, unable to commit, unable to say yes. She'd been afraid of making the wrong choice, afraid of losing her independence, afraid of all the ways marriage could go wrong. But now, understanding Margaret's story, understanding how brief and precious life could be, her fear seemed small. Mark was a good man. He loved her. She loved him. Why was she waiting? What was she afraid of? The nightmares stopped after that trip to Ashford. Claire had integrated the memory, processed the trauma, understood the lesson. Margaret's death no longer needed to haunt her dreams. And 3 weeks later, Claire said yes to Mark's proposal. They got married that summer, in a simple ceremony, not unlike Margaret and William's wedding 100 years earlier. Claire found herself making quiet promises to the memory of Margaret. This time, she would live fully. This time, she wouldn't let fear hold her back. This time, she would appreciate every ordinary moment with her partner, because she knew from experience how suddenly it could all end. She also wrote about her experience, publishing an article in a journal focused on consciousness studies. Other people reached out with their own stories of verifiable past life memories. The phenomenon was more common than she'd realized. And while mainstream science still couldn't explain it, the evidence kept accumulating. Too many details that matched historical records. Too many memories that checked out. Dr. Mason used Claire's case in his research, with her permission. The level of verification was unusual. Most past life regressions could be confirmed because the details were too vague, or the time periods too distant. But Claire's memory of Margaret had been specific enough, recent enough, that solid documentation existed. Claire also stayed connected to Ashford. She visited several times, walking the streets Margaret had walked, visiting the site where the house on Maple Street had stood before it burned. A different house occupied the lot now, built in the 1930s, but the old foundation stones were still visible in the basement. She felt a connection to the town, to its history, to the life that had been lived there, and she felt gratitude to Margaret for the lesson her brief life had provided. Love deeply. Live fully. Don't wait for the perfect moment, because there is no perfect moment. There's just now. And now is all we ever really have. Margaret Foster died in 1924, in a house fire in Ashford, New York. The historical records prove it. The newspaper documented it. The photographs show the house and the man she loved. And 100 years later, her soul remembered. Her story was told, and her brief life had meaning again. If you've ever felt that pull toward a place you've never been, if you've ever met someone and felt that impossible familiarity, if you've ever known something you shouldn't be able to know, maybe you're remembering too. Maybe your soul carries stories waiting to be told. The question is whether you're ready to listen. Subscribe to hear more stories that checked out when no one thought they would.